I think we have so institutionalized, a very aggressive posture towards China that I'm not sure that we could respond if and when China sort of were to change course on these very problematic approaches that I think do hobble international cooperation in response to shared challenges.
Can the U.S. and China play nice enough with each other to not ruin the planet in the coming century? In particular, what prospects are there for cooperation around climate and biotech? To discuss, I have on today Scott Moore, Penn's Director of China Programs and Strategic Initiatives, and perhaps the nicest person on China Twitter. Low bar, but, still counts for something. Scott is the author of China's Next Act, How Sustainability and Technology Are Reshaping China's Rise in the World's Future. Scott, welcome to China Talk.
Thanks so much, Jordan. It's really a pleasure, and I appreciate the plug, even if it's a low bar on China Twitter.
So I want to start in the 1950s and the fight against polio. How did the U.S. and the Soviet Union figure out how to work together to eradicate a really horrific disease?
So it's a great question, Jordan, to think about in the context of where we are today between the United States, China, and other countries when it comes to heightened geopolitical rivalry, but also the need to cooperate to some degree on shared global challenges. And as your question points out, we did see examples during the Cold War of when the United States and the Soviet Union were able to undertake some joint action in response to what we now think of as global public good issues, in this case, public health. And what happened specifically was that the United States really was the site of origin of the polio vaccines. Those were an American invention, so to speak, an American technology, if you want to put it that way, or American developed technology. But the use of them, and specifically the approach that was used to mass inoculation using the polio vaccine, was actually developed in the Soviet bloc, specifically Hungary. And so there was some degree of U.S.-Soviet governmental cooperation that buttressed that. But what you also saw is this process of where an American-developed technology was essentially utilized by the Soviet bloc and then used to develop an approach or a methodology to be able to deploy it effectively and to achieve something close to total eradication of polio. So it was really an example of where you saw the two countries, to some degree, working together to advance a global public good despite an atmosphere of very high mistrust and geopolitical rivalry, not unlike what we see today between the United States and China.
What do you think was special about the polio vaccine, which allowed this cooperation to happen even in the first place?
Well, you have to keep in mind, and again, this is a situation that does have relevance to the present day, but there were some important differences. One thing to remember about polio is that it was a universal scourge. This was a terrible, terrible, debilitating disease that disproportionately affects children, and for that reason was widely feared, across countries. That was a commonality that was not shaped in any way by geopolitics, and so every country, including the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, the Soviet bloc countries as well, saw a common need to combat this shared scourge.
Yeah, I thought the sort of, to get even one level lower down into the details, the story of the fact that all the Americans already were vaccinated, and the Soviet Union offering up Hungary as a test bed for this vaccine. It's hard to imagine something like that with all the stories around microchips and America planning COVID or whatever, being something that there would be enough trust to do.
Absolutely agree with that point, Jordan, and it is important to underscore that there are major differences. There's lots of kind of a whole cottage industry around drawing sort of comparisons between the Cold War and the current tensions that exist, particularly in U.S.-China relations. But there are some important differences, and you alluded to one in particular. Though I will point out And this maybe takes us in toward another aspect of things that the book covers. But it really wasn't so long ago, about 7 years ago, that the United States and China did mount a reasonably successful joint public health effort in response to the 2014-2015 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. So I think you're right that we've gotten to a place where it's hard to see that level of trust. And yet we do have examples, even in the relatively recent past, of when this type of joint action was possible.
Yeah, it's really interesting thinking back to Ebola because like you have this sort of strain of U.S.-China competition of who's going to like do better for the developing world, which I think if somehow that is the sort of that ends up being like the quote unquote battlefield, it could end up having really positive ramifications for the planet, but also, figuring out how to, not turn like the third world battlefield into a Cold War era, like proxy war type thing. And instead, how are we going to solve your healthcare and infrastructure problems in a more effective way for your people? Dimension would end up being, not the worst timeline for the 21st century to fall into. Thoughts on that, Scott? You do speak a fair amount in this book about how, there are venues like on, some global health and development topics where you can have you can have competition end up leading to kind of like net positive benefits for the planet.
Yeah, you hit on a couple of important things there, Jordan. First of all, as you mentioned, I do talk quite a bit in the book about how we can make progress in response to tackling shared global challenges like climate change and public health through competition as well as through cooperation and other kind of modes of interaction and engagement. I talk especially about how I think the idea of economic, geopolitical, even ideological competition can be good for clean technology development. I think it can also potentially be helpful in terms of providing a practical justification to increase public funding and financing for adaptation to climate change as well as mitigation. But it's also worth noting that I think this idea of competition is in many ways a second best strategy. It's probably not what you would choose from a blank sheet of paper as the ideal approach to trying to tackle these shared global challenges. It's a reflection of realities. It's a reflection not just of political realities in terms of where we are in the U.S.-China relationship and China's relationship with other major countries, but it's also a reflection of the direction I think that China has taken over the past decade.
Scott, Marshall Nie Rongjen, who's he?
Nie Rongjen was a significant figure in the People's Liberation Army during the Chinese Civil War period, and during the Korean War era was essentially appointed by Mao to serve as kind of a national resource mobilization czar. And he really laid the foundation for China's approach to science, technology, and innovation in the decades that followed. And the approach that he laid out was one that borrowed heavily from the Soviet Union and that had a couple of key elements. One was the idea of leapfrogging, that it was important to equip these socialist economies to leapfrog ahead of their Western capitalist peers, including through development of key industrial processes and technologies. The second aspect, and as that implies, as that sort of priority implies, is a very strong role for the state. Especially, and here's the third key characteristic, something called the task-oriented approach, which is the idea that the state essentially sets priorities for science, technology, and innovation that then scientists, engineers, researchers are expected to pursue. Often these were set via 5-year plans. it's important to underscore that that differs in a key way from the approach typically taken in the West, and particularly in the United States, which is much more bottom up. There are funding agencies to which individual researchers or sometimes, laboratories, universities apply for funding, and it's typically part of an open call that provides quite a bit of discretion or leeway for the researchers or the institutions or the entities conducting the research to determine the priorities or directions of their research. And that's an important distinction with the task-oriented approach that's really baked into the DNA of China's approach to SDI, thanks largely to Marshall Nia.
So Marshall Nia, he didn't come up with this by himself. There was, I've been reading A Stalin and the Bomb lately, thanks to Joseph Terigian's suggestion, which is a really fun deep dive into the sort of like early years of science and technology in the Soviet Union, and catch up and overtake. This is absolutely a Leninist. It dates back to sort of like, is it Lenin? Or let me read a quote. This is kind of fun.
But certainly the kind of model set by the Soviet state from the 1920s onward.
Yeah, so there's a great line from this book talking about in the 1930s how the psychology of catch up and overtake militated against technological innovation on the basis of original Soviet research. This slogan implied that the Soviet Union was following the path that more advanced countries already traveled, and it was always less risky to do something that had already been done abroad than to try out an untested Soviet idea. So proposals from Soviet scientists were likely to be ignored unless they had been validated by foreign experience. And so it's really interesting is like you have this tension both in the Chinese as well as the Soviet system, where on the one hand you have this like worshiping of Chinese technology, and on the other hand you have this strain of like, we need to do something totally crazy because we're really far behind. And this is kind of how you get, Lysenkoism, and then you get, all of the, outrageous stuff that happened in the Mao era when it comes to science and technology, where, a lot of, absolutely illogical things were put forward because you had workers which were more red, who were saying, you should make steel in this way, not that way.
Yes. And I think that's a really important point to underline, Jordan. You're absolutely right. And I would sort of add to that. And, there are sort of two other, I think, commonalities between the sort of Chinese and Soviet experience in science, technology, innovation. One is this sense of perhaps not quite desperation, but, acting more out of necessity than intention. And I think that's, one characteristic of Nia's approach, which is to say that we have to pursue military and civilian priorities, for example, in parallel and in an integrated fashion, because we simply don't have the resources to pursue them independently. And that, of course, eventually informed what we now think of as civil-military fusion, for example.
So Lenin argued that it was, quote, necessary to take all the culture that capitalism has left and build socialism out of it, to take all the science, the technology, all the knowledge and art. Without this, we cannot build the life of communist society. Quote ends. He understood that science and technology were necessary for defense and for economic developments. In March 1918, when the Soviet government was forced to sign the punitive Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, he drew the lesson that, quote, it is necessary to master the highest technology or be crushed. When he began the slogan, quote, communism equals Soviet power plus electrification of the whole country in 1920, he was doing more than just popularizing his plan for electrification. He was also conveying the message that socialism was to be created by technological progress as well as socialist revolution, which I think the CCP imbibed whole cloth.
Yep, I would agree. And, certainly this time period, there's a tremendous amount of that going on, which was later, conveniently denied by both sides after the Sino-Soviet split. But yes, there's a tremendous amount of cross-fertilization here, and as you pointed out, a tremendous amount of borrowing that went on, including in terms of outlook, organization of the bureaucracy, really very substantial cross-fertilization.
How, if at all, have these themes played out in the context of China's development in biotechnology?
So I think biotechnology is a really interesting and perhaps the most important area to look at when it comes to technological competition between the US and China for a couple of reasons. One, the US has historically, since the end of the Second World War, roughly been really the locus for biotechnology research around the world. And a big part of that actually is because of a very large continued investment over time in federal support for biomedical and other forms of biotech research through the National Institutes of Health and other mechanisms. But suffice to say, it's long been a priority, and the U.S. has really been the kind of overwhelming powerhouse, if you want to sort of think of it that way, in biotechnology. And it's not just in the research, but it's also in the commercialization, the kind of salience of the U.S. pharmaceutical industry, et cetera, et cetera. It's really been the powerhouse in the sector. China, on the other hand, and as we talked about earlier, China has always really heavily prioritized science, technology, innovation investments. But historically, China's kind of research and development enterprise was stronger, put more resources in, was generally more kind of better organized in the physical sciences and natural sciences than in the life sciences. Starting in the early 1980s and accelerating pretty consistently since then, Beijing tried to increase investment in the sector, tried to steadily increase the priority given to biotechnology in 5-year and other plans to try to remedy that. And the main reason for that was that biotechnology, and in particular developments in just the last 15 years or so, have catapulted the industry and the sector forward. And the single biggest probably leap technologically that's important to mention is the development of CRISPR, which is a tool that allows for fairly easy and straightforward editing of genes and genomes. And you combine that with big data analytics, the integration of artificial intelligence, other things, and we're really kind of poised for biotechnology to make some very, very significant technological improvements, and probably therefore to have a really big impact in the business world, in the geopolitical and security world, and pretty much every other aspect of our lives. And so in the book, I do have a pretty large focus on China's role in this increasingly important sector.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about the scary parts of biotech. How could these developments kill us all, Scott?
So that is something that I focus on in the book, though it's worth noting that these developments in biotechnology have, there's a lot of promise, particularly to eradicate diseases and things like that, to improve medicine. But there are some really scary things out there. And I think the reason I focus on them in the book is because they're more or less of equal concern to the U.S. And China and other major countries. And therefore, I think, do create some type of shared interest in developing rules and guardrails around gene editing, synthetic biology, and other advanced forms of biotechnology research. But what those dangers are, there are two in particular that I talk about in the book. One is the risk of essentially synthetic or novel forms of bioterrorism, where malign actors, whether they're terrorist groups or some other kind of entity set out to do great harm, could, without a huge investment of resources and without too much in the way of specialized knowledge, could, through the use of gene editing, create or modify viruses or create other dangerous organisms that might enable the specific targeting of of particular human populations, or otherwise just sort of wreak mass havoc. The other kind of related and probably even more likely danger that I think we have to think of is the risk of sloppy or accidental research that is essentially creates a dangerous new organism, not intentionally, not because the originator or the inventor was had some evil intention, but just because they were sloppy or made a mistake, and that organism, whether it's a virus or something else, then gets released into the environment and causes real damage or ecological disruption. And that is a risk that is increasing rapidly along with the development of gene editing as a field and the number of research entities and institutions that are pursuing it. And I think ultimately these risks create a real need for international collective action to try to create some guardrails and rules. And there are efforts underway, quite a few actually, to do that. But I think where China comes into the picture is that because of its massive investment and progress really in the biotech sector, none of those efforts are going to be successful without China and without Beijing's buy-in to some extent.
So, what does the 1973 conference in Alabama, California, teach us about how the U.S. and China could potentially find ways to reduce risk when it comes to biotech?
Well, so one thing that's kind of common to, it's really kind of a common challenge, I think, for both Beijing, Washington, other kind of governments around the world who are interested in trying to limit some of the risks posed by emerging technologies, is that the technology is advancing sufficiently quickly that it's really hard for governments and states to keep up. And that's more or less as true for China as it is the U.S. or other countries. And for that reason, a lot of the de facto kind of work of creating and following safeguards really comes down to individual scientists or researchers or laboratories. It's really kind of fundamentally something that the subnational or kind of sub-state, so to speak, sector really is at the cutting edge of. And the reason I mentioned this, probably obscure to most people, 1973 Asilomar conference, there were actually two, at a place called Asilomar, California, which is gorgeous, by the way, right on the Pacific Ocean, is that it involved a group of researchers who came together in the early 70s. These were people working in the sort of early stages of research into what eventually kind of became the field of gene editing. And they were really concerned by the prospect of unintentionally creating potentially dangerous viruses. And they agreed on a set of protocols and safeguards to guide their research, including one of the first mentions of what subsequently has been become known rather as the precautionary principle, which is something that basically says the more potentially risky a research step or research approach might be, the higher the bar should be to pursuing it. Sounds straightforward, but is pretty fundamental to research safety, research security, research ethics around the world. And that was something that really kind of came out of or was first really popularized through this set of talks and dialogues, mostly between scientists. The key thing to note about the Asilomar conferences, though, is that they were almost entirely dominated by representatives from the U.S. and a couple of Western European countries. The second one included, if I recall correctly, one or two Japanese representatives, but very few non-Western representatives at all. And that really reflected the fact that at the time, the overwhelming majority of biotechnology research was concentrated in the advanced industrial countries. If you were to, I think it's a promising model to follow, but now you would have to include a much broader swath of countries, including China. But I think it's nonetheless a powerful example of how scientists and researchers can themselves kind of jumpstart the development and evolution of safeguards to try to reduce some of the risks associated with these very disruptive emerging technologies.
Yeah. So Scott, I guess your theory of the case is that like if enough global scientists can get together and agree on some principles, then there will be sort of like norms created in the ether, which will then sort of end up flowing up until what scientists around the world.
I mean, yes, but it's not quite as. First of all, I wouldn't say I'm quite as airily optimistic as that. I would say that I think that kind of approach, the sort of bottom up scientist-led approach, I think it's practical, it's feasible for now as a first step, but it's no replacement for some type of international agreement, which ultimately is what I think will be required. And it is, again, I think, a second best to some type of intergovernmental cooperation between the U.S., China, other countries. I just think, unfortunately, that's as a practical matter, a non-starter right now.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my concern is that with stuff like biotech and advanced AI, like the upside payoff of maybe pushing the precautionary principle a little further than you would in a vacuum is going to be tempting enough from a sort of commercial as well as like national power perspective that it will be very hard to draw kind of lines in the sand around these types of emerging technologies in the way that the U.S. and Soviet Union ultimately successfully did when it came to the use of nuclear weapons. But I hope.
I hope you are too, Jordan. But I also don't disagree. I think my message here, though, is this is something we have to make a start on. And I agree with you. I don't see a lot of near-term potential. But the risks are out there; they're real, and they're coming down the pike fast in terms of really becoming things that we need to think very seriously about. And so, for that reason, we have to make a start, even if it's sort of a suboptimal, perhaps unlikely to succeed approach. We have to start somewhere.
So what gets us out of this dynamic? Is it the aliens invading? She dying, I don't know, Bernie Sanders is president. Like like how do you have any sort of not like greater than like 3% probability futures, which end up leaving the world in a better place from a U.S.-China perspective, at least to address these sorts of challenges?
I would say it's maybe more of like a 10%, kind of scenario. But I do have to kind of start by saying I don't think there's much medium-term hope of significant improvement in U.S.-China relations, and that's a lot of the reason why I think we just have to think differently about how to try to tackle shared global challenges, not just through this idea of we have to find ways to cooperate and wall off issues like climate change. That's not realistic. It has never been the way that these issues get tackled. That is an example we can take from the Cold War. And it's just time to think differently. We can't assume that there's going to be some magical improvement in U.S.-China bilateral relations. That said, one of the things I end the book by talking a little bit about is that I worry that we are, particularly in the United States, but to a large degree, other kind of allied and aligned countries, Germany comes to mind, really hardening China policy to the extent that if China were to change direction, and I emphasize I have no near to medium term belief that will happen, but if it does, I don't think we could respond. I think we have so institutionalized, a very aggressive posture towards China that I'm not sure that we could respond if and when China sort of were to change course on these very problematic approaches that I think do hobble international cooperation in response to shared challenges. So, I wouldn't put the percentage much higher than you would, but I think there's a chance. And I think what I would, kind of reflect on is that I think our approach has been really to institutionalize this very, very aggressive posture and eliminate a lot of the desirable flexibility that should otherwise be built into that. And let me make one other related point: whether or not China kind of changes or sort of otherwise modifies certain problematic kind of political stances. One thing that we are seeing is what appears to be a pretty dramatic and sustained change in China's inputs into global economic growth. And in fact, the kind of signs are adding up that we're likely to see something close to a prolonged economic stagnation or some form of kind of stasis for the Chinese economy. There are a lot of implications that would flow from that. And I think they do call into question some of the assumptions around China's rise that inform a lot of current policy across the West.
Scott, I want to change tacks a little bit to close. You are involved with one of America's largest China research endeavors in all the stuff that Penn University does from a China studies context. I've written a long piece for the EA Forum and have been reading a lot about what China studies needs to do and become and grow and evolve into in the coming decades. Thinking about the sort of what happened for Russia studies in particular in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and area studies more generally.
Yeah.
Cold War. I'm curious, Scott, your broad take on where China research is today and where it needs to be for us to have the best chance of not completely ruining the planet in or frame it however you want, ruining the planet, improving American competitiveness. So how much more juice is there left to be squeezed from a China studies angle, regardless of what you want to do with that knowledge?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Jordan, and really a great one to sort of maybe end on in terms of reflection. So I think American sort of Chinese studies has always been, I think, relatively strong and certainly numerous compared to China studies in other countries. And I think by and large does continue to have a lot of strengths, but with a couple really key challenges, and you already identified a couple of them. One is something that's been occurring to area studies, regional studies across the board for some time, which has been declining enrollments, particularly in language courses. And that is something that I think we definitely need to find ways to counter, probably through increased investment in language training and just in the kind of essentially rewards and incentives that we're creating for people to be really adept at particularly reading in Chinese. I think the other aspect that you hinted at, which is more, graduate students, folks who are already in the field, just how they're able to conduct their work. And that's something that has been of great concern lately, not only in light of the difficulties in physically traveling to China, but concerns about increasing difficulty in accessing archives, conducting the types of fieldwork interviews and things like that would have been pretty normal for researchers 5+ years ago. And that is something I think we'll just have to we'll just have to see what the post-pandemic reality looks like. I do think there would be room for the U.S. government in conjunction with its partners and allies to make that an issue in bilateral relations. I don't know what the prospect of success would be, but it is fundamentally not in China's interest if those who are the source of expertise on China in foreign countries are not able to meaningfully engage with China. That should be something that's of concern to Beijing. The other kind of thing that, as you probably have heard, people are talking a lot more about how you make use of digital humanities, sources that have been digitally archived and therefore are accessible outside China, as well as the use of satellites, remote sensing, other kind of remote technologies, so to speak, to conduct research. And I think in the short term, that will be the direction that a lot of folks, particularly in the social sciences, take with respect to China studies. But the long-term implications are really concerning if we don't see some type of improvement in not just kind of U.S.-China governmental relations, but U.S.-China academic relations. And I think to a large extent that's mirrored as well.
May. 如果不去抢的话，就没有人会给我，没有人会可怜他们，只会想办法摧毁我。说尽体面的话，再把所有罪都归我。失败的滋味是他们嘴里吐的碎梦那些脆弱，可我不能停，除了此刻没有其他机会可以赢，所以我不留余力，不犹豫去拿起了笔，发誓可以发起为你复仇的心。3年时间过去了，我还是舞台上最疯的神经刀。感谢一路陪我走来的人，感谢妹还有陈立涛。我们有不同的理想，上帝给了我们不同的任务。我曾经不懂，以为敌人就是敌人，直到刘聪告诉我保持愤怒，放逐到内心的野兽，换一个角度，再换一种意见。你永远不会被接受，直到把自己看作其中一员。当我终于可以敞开心扉，让灵魂自由飞翔着，才明白我从来没憎恨过谁，我只是想成为最强的。3年时间过去了，我终于不再把内心给藏起来，终于我找到了一席之地，小老头早安和王一探。我想我有时候做人太直，有时候说话太难听，可我真没想到有一天我会和爱热坐在一起谈心。我喜欢把照片光着，直到看到妈妈生动的脸。我以为你们是装的，直到我被皇帝唱红了眼。当我终于可以敞开心扉，让灵魂自由飞翔着，才明白我从来没憎恨过谁，我只是想成为最强的。 的嘴。Cause oh oh oh，回到我的王位。